I'm Jim Cameron. I am a columnist for CT Mirror and CT Examiner, and I write a column every week, every Sunday, called Talking Transportation, in a bunch of online publications I used to write for Hearst. And being a columnist is different than being a reporter, which I was for many years. I worked at NBC News. I received a Peabody Award, an Armstrong Award, and I left to form my own consultancy. But as a commentator, I try to use Thomas Friedman from the New York Times as my role model, and he described his job of offering thoughts and opinions as well as facts as being in the heating business and the lighting business. The heating business, in that he's trying to kind of light a fire under people's backsides, and the lighting business, meaning that, he actually tries to support his opinions with facts. What a concept. So what do I want to talk with you about today? I want to talk about why we're talking about transportation in the first place, of all the things we could be discussing. What was going on before COVID hit, what's happened since, how we are adapting and still adapting on the trains, the buses, and the highways, and what I think are some potential dangers ahead. And then we'll have time for Q&A as well. So why are we talking about transportation? I recommend this book. It's called The King's Best Highway. It was written by Eric Jaffe, a young man, an urban planner who works in New York City, and I had a chance to interview him. The book is all about the Boston Post Road and how the road between New York and Boston has grown and changed and affected those communities that are along it for many, many years. In the 1700s, it took 7 days to go by land from New York to Boston. There was no King's Highway, there was no Post Road. It was Indian trails, and it was arduous. But that was the way that back then people needed to communicate. If you wanted to get news from New York to Boston that the British are coming, you literally had to get yourself up there to share that news. Today, we just fire up this technology, Zoom. And as long as we find the mute switch on our microphone, we're golden. And by the way, we really don't need to travel as much as we used to, because COVID has changed everything. Our reasons for going there have changed. Why commute if you can telecommute? Why go into a store if you can order online? Why go to the movies if you can watch Netflix? And the big question that people in the transportation field are worried about is, will people come back to the office? And what do we do if they don't come back to the office? Now, they're starting to trickle in, and I'll tell you what that data looks like. This used to be what people's offices looked like, some palatial, estate. This is what most offices looked like in the past 3 years, sitting at a desk in your kitchen, or if you were burdened with childcare, also taking care of the kids on your laptop, as the two laptops, one child and one computer as well. So I want to talk about Metro North, which for those of you up in the Bloomfield area may not have as much significance as CT Transit, CT Fast Track, the Hartford line, but I'll talk about those as well. Metro North is important because Metro North is the carotid artery of Fairfield County. People live in Fairfield County because of the ease of getting to a job in New York City and that proximity and the reliability of the train. If that train doesn't run, yes, they'll be able to work from home now, but that didn't used to be the case. So pre-COVID, Metro North was carrying 3 million passengers a month. They were on time 97% of the time, and there were 2 or 3 trains each hour during rush hour, 2 trains off peak on the main line between New Haven and New York City. The service was pretty good. What's happened since? On-time arrivals have been down ever so slightly, but ridership is only back to a peak 3 days a week of about 70%. Some days it's in the 50s, some days it's in the 60s. Monday and Friday, go down to your local train station parking lot. take a look at all the empty spaces and you'll know people are working from home, and they may only be going into the city once or twice a week. This is what the train looked like pre-COVID. People were standing room only for an hour and a half in each direction and paying $450 a month for the privilege of doing that. COVID hit, plenty of empty seats. To their credit, that railroad kept operating all through the pandemic. 7 MTA employees died in the early days of COVID, before we knew to put on masks. Grand Central looked like this. It was pretty much a ghost town. The parking lots, again, the best gauge I know of looking at ridership. This is what Fairfield's parking lot looked like in 2010. This is what my parking lot looked like in early 2021. Not many people coming back, but that parking lot's pretty full now. Pre-COVID, trains were packed. COVID hits, it's not as crowded, and people are wearing a mask because the MTA, under the guidance of the CDC, told us that it was aerosolization, it was the air transmission of COVID that made it the most contagious, not surface contact, even though they were running around disinfecting everything in sight, spraying the cars and wiping them down. 1 in 10,000 chance, said the CDC, of getting COVID from contact. But if somebody sneezes at you, 100%. So they started to educate people about how and why they had to wear a mask. Well, it wasn't local option. It wasn't even the MTA rule. It was the CDC and the FDA that came down and issued it as an edict, a gubernatorial order. But it took some education. Even the conductors, see this guy on the left here, he's not wearing it properly. His nose, his schnoz is hanging out over the edge. People were regularly sending me pictures of bros standing in the vestibule, drinking and carrying on without a mask on. The mask rules were not enforced. That's the problem. This was a TSA rule. It was mandatory on trains, planes, and buses. Metro North, however, left enforcement compliance with the MTA police, of whom I believe there are 6 officers in all of Connecticut. So the railroad did pass out masks on a daily basis. If they saw somebody not wearing a mask, they'd give him a mask. He still wouldn't necessarily put it on. They were facing a $50 fine in New York City, $100 in Connecticut for noncompliance. But CT Examiner, one of the news sites I worked for, did an FOI request in July of 2021 and found out that there had not been a single citation issued in Connecticut. They were just not enforcing that rule. Since then, the TSA lifted the rule in April of this year. The MTA, MTA in one hand was stretching its hand out asking for federal aid, and in the other hand, they were not enforcing a federal health mandate. Shame on them. They did some things right. One of the things that the MTA has done increasingly well is use technology. If you're going to take Metro North, you probably want to download, as 6,000 people a day do, the MTA's Train Time app. And one of the things that's on that app, in addition to the timetable, and you can buy tickets and check the arrival of your train, they found a way of encouraging people to spread out. Remember when social distancing was the norm? You don't want to be sitting cheek to jowl on a crowded car if there's 2 others empty behind you. So they used technology, some students at Stanford University, to take the technology of the cars themselves, which, like all subway cars and all rail cars, weigh themselves when they leave a station. When the doors close, they weigh themselves because they need to know how much heavier they are now than when they entered the station, so that they can apply the brakes more enthusiastically when they have to. So the Stanford students just said, well, let's flip that around. Let's look for the car that's the lightest and tell people on the platform with a color code, red, yellow, green, where they're likely to find the fewest number of passengers. The car is the lightest. and the most empty seats. Good for them. And they use that technology very well. So if you're on the train platform, you can look at this app in 5 minutes. They'll tell you, go to the end of the train or go to the middle car. It allows people to spread out and avoid the crowding, and it's available on all the mainline trains, not the branch line trains. I don't think it's available on the Hartford line. What we're really talking about is how the railroads have adapted to the loss of revenue. Where is the money that's making them whole? They cannot continue to operate if they didn't have the money. The MTA, the parent of Metro North, admits it is facing, these are their words, a fiscal cliff. The federal government bailed out the MTA in New York City alone to the tune of $15 billion, as they did other transit agencies around the country. That money was expected, according to McKinsey, who did the consulting work on this, that was expected until the mid-2020s, at which point McKinsey predicted ridership would be back to 92%. Not happening. The federal money, as a result, is running out before 2024. And that's when the modeling now says they might have maybe 73% of ridership. That may be underestimating it now. However, MTA is still spending $51 billion on various capital improvements, not the least of which is the opening of the new Long Island Railroad station underneath Grand Central. That'll be happening in December. But they're also investing in subway signals and new trains and buses and ADA access and elevators. They're counting on congestion pricing for automobile traffic in Midtown Manhattan to come up with the money to make up the difference between the federal money, which is going to be gone, and what they need to keep operating the trains. But that congestion pricing is still stalled. Now, what's going to happen if they don't get that money? Well, there are only three variable costs that the railroad has. One is labor. And early on in the pandemic, they promised no layoffs. It was the right move, because when they wanted to get service back, those people were still on the job. They had all effectively taken a 40% pay cut, not by having their salary reduced, but because they weren't getting the overtime that they used to get on a regular basis. There are car cleaners that make close to six figures working for MTA and Metro North. So there were no layoffs. They're not planning any more cuts yet, but this is one of the three things they have some control over. Schedules. If they don't run as many trains, they won't be paying any overtime at all, even if they keep everybody on the schedule. They won't be paying conductors. They won't be paying for electricity. They won't be paying for maintenance. But the question is, can they cut service and still maintain some sort of a ridership? If your train is only running once an hour instead of twice an hour, will you think twice and go, I'll just drive? We don't want them to be driving. Trust me. Come down and take a look at I-95. So we're not sure about reductions in service. And the other thing they can control is to bring more money in, not to spend less money, but bring more money in by raising fares. But can they raise fares without discouraging ridership as well, too? There's no easy answers here. How are they going to come up with this money? One of the things you need to realize is that the train ticket does not pay the actual cost of the ride. Even pre-COVID, every trip on those standing room only trains was subsidized. The fare did not cover the actual cost. The subsidy on the main line per passenger per trip is $3.25. On the Danbury branch, $17. Waterbury, $24 per ticket. Shoreline East, it's almost $50 per ride per passenger per ticket. And the winner of this bad list contest, the Hartford line, which is still expensive but doesn't have the ridership, and the subsidy is $55, almost $56 per passenger per trip, and that's using when the ridership was 100%. If the ridership is down a third, revenues are down a third. Do the math. The subsidy is hemorrhaging money. And when the federal money runs out, I doubt it's going to get renewed. So one of the things that I predicted back in my column in 2020, which did not win me any friends at Metro North, was I predicted that rail commuters would not all be coming back ever, not to the numbers that they used to, because people now know they do not need to go to work to be able to do their work. And in many cases, the bosses realized that as well and realized they had far too much expensive real estate. I know law firms in New York City that have closed entire floors of office buildings in Midtown and consolidated, into one space with a lot of shared cubicles and meeting rooms, because most of their employees are very much often working from home still. Fewer commuters, trains and buses, planes, to hell with that. I'm not getting there tonight. Fewer commuters means higher deficits, and that's the $64 question. How are we going to balance this budget? One other consideration that nobody seems to be talking about is what's going to happen to transit-oriented development, TOD. The idea was to put development around the train and bus stations so that there'd be offices and condos and apartments and restaurants, and people could live there because they take the train every day going to where they're going to work, and they might not need 2 cars per family. They might get by with one. What's going to happen to the development if the transit side's not there? And I give you a case in point. In my town of Darien, at the Norotan Heights train station is a huge development that's almost nearing completion. It's called Darien Commons. And it's got upstairs here, I wonder if you can see my mouse. It's got upstairs over these gabled roofs. Those are apartments at New York City style and certainly expensive rents. $1,600 for a studio, up to $5,500 a month for a 3-bedroom. And then downstairs, there are beautiful restaurants and coffee shops, and there's a Walgreens and a supermarket. And all of this is right across the street from the train station. Next time you're going in on the train to New York City, look up to your right when you go through Norotan Heights, and you'll see this. It's going to be gorgeous. It's going to have its own little deck area, and they're going to have, I don't know, everything except a hot tub and a jacuzzi. They might have that too. I don't know. It's gorgeous, beautiful. The idea being, one of the directors of our Planning and Zoning Commission said to me, and he works in real estate, he sees developments like this in other areas around the tri-state area. He said he's seen them in Westchester that weren't even near a train station, but became their own little world, their own little microcosm, where people could live in the apartment, they could go across the street to the supermarket, they could go to the doctor's office or the dentist office in the same complex, maybe the veterinarian, go see their lawyer, and never have to leave the property. They're like in the compound. So we'll see. There's a lot riding on those kind of decisions, and a lot of this is in progress already. So how do we get people back on the train? This is the $65 question, having asked the $64 question. What's the $65 question? How do we keep people back on the train? I asked that question on social media, on our Facebook and our Twitter feeds, and they came back with a bunch of themes. One of the first ones was better ventilation. The windows on our cars do not open. Suddenly, everybody wants ventilation. It used to be we all wanted to be sealed up and be energy efficient. Not anymore. They wanted cleaning. They wanted to know that the car was clean, as it should be, COVID or no. The biggest thing they wanted was more speed, because the trains have been running slow since the derailments in Bridgeport and Fairfield under regulations of the FRA, the Federal Railroad Administration. Those speeds have not been resumed. As one commuter told me, his 50-minute commute in 2004 now takes 20 minutes longer. The further east you go, the longer the delays are adding up. So, I mean, it could commute from New Haven now, with the exception of a couple of express trains early in the morning at like 5:30. I think it takes an extra half hour longer than it used to. The more you squeeze the commuting circle around the city by making the speed slower, the less attractive outer borough areas like Bridgeport, Monroe become to the commuter. He wants to know, or she wants to know, they can get into the city in an hour or less. One of the problems is there's too many stops. I mean, if you run on a train from New Haven to Grand Central, it, with the exception of a few expresses, as I said, it probably makes 5 or 6 stops just before it gets to Stamford. And then it may make another stop in Greenwich on the way in. The more stops, the slower it gets. Some people suggested reserved seating. They do that in Japan, where crowding was a big issue. Wi-Fi on the trains. I've written about this before. There is no Wi-Fi on Metro North, and it wouldn't happen, or it hasn't happened yet, but it won't be happening if it wasn't for the fact the legislature ponied up $27 million to give the railroad to sweeten the pot and get them going. Bar cars. We used to have bar cars on Metro North, the last commuter railroad with bar cars in the United States. They went the way of the dodo when they finally wore out and the gaffer's tape couldn't keep things held together in the bar area. Lower fares. One of the things that the railroad was facing was the fact that people were not buying monthly commutation tickets. Pre-COVID, the people that bought those monthly passes represented 47% of all the revenue that was brought in ticket sales every month. These days, it's about 5%. Even if you buy a 10-trip ticket, the reason people aren't buying monthlies is they're not commuting 5 days a week. The math doesn't work out unless you're taking the train 10 times a week. And if you're taking the train 10 times a week, you deserve my condolences in addition to a discount. They had a 10-trip ticket, but it expired after 6 months. Well, now, somewhere in that sweet spot is, why don't you buy a 20-trip ticket, which gives you a discount over the regular fare? And you probably will take, if you go in twice a week, 4 weeks out of the month, that's 8. You might even be incentivized to take the kids in on the weekend or something like that. Another way of saving money is to reduce staffing on the trains. Do we really need conductors walking between the cars looking at tickets? In Europe, in San Diego, in other cities, progressive cities, they work on the honor system. They have inspectors that go around. You have to have a ticket to be on the train. If the inspector makes a spot check and finds you do not have a ticket, it's a $250 fine. A mistake you only make once. So you could save a lot of money by not having to staff the trains as heavily as well. Yeah, and the other suggestion I have was make the train stations look nice, okay? This ain't a bus station. It could be attractive. Put some flowers in. Make sure that the waiting room, there's a waiting room with a door on it, and heat in the winter, and maybe air conditioning in the summer. A safe place to sit and wait for my train. A lot of stations don't even have that anymore. And the guy or gal that used to run the coffee stand and sell newspapers, boom, gone, long gone. It's BYO these days. So that's the train. Let's talk about the highways, because the highways are quite the opposite problem. Traffic on the highways is back to pre-COVID levels at rush hour and well beyond. However, the gasoline tax revenues, which subsidize mass transit and highway repairs and go into the special transportation fund, are down, way down, because there's been a gas tax holiday since the spring, when the state lifted the gasoline tax until just after the November elections. Call me a cynic, but I think the timing is far from coincidental. That gas tax holiday did bring some good news, though. The problem is that the gas tax has to be made up by the state, which is awash in money right now. You cannot use federal infrastructure money from the Build Back Better Biden plan. That must be spent on capital equipment, not operating costs. Operating costs have to be paid for out of the fare box or subsidies from the state. However, as I wrote about a couple of weeks ago, it's like Carmageddon out there on the interstates right now. People are speeding. The number of deaths is astronomical. 20,000 Americans have died in the first 6 months of this year, a number that has only grown during the pandemic. There is so much road rage out there. Don't get me started with, daylight street shootings or anything. But I did have the chance when I was writing my column for the Hearst papers, I had my chance to meet Sean Mansfield, state trooper. And Sean gave me what's called a ride around, not the run around, a ride around. I got to ride with him during morning rush hour as a reporter. And I got to watch him in action using the computer and the technology in the car. He literally has technology there that he can look up anybody's driver's license, any plate number in the United States, and immediately be told if there's an arrest warrant or an outstanding, reason to pull that guy over. Automatically, some of the cars even have license plate readers. There's not much room in that car once you put all that technology in, as I found out, because I had to wedge myself into the passenger seat, and I'm not a small guy. Plus, the first thing they did when I went there was they put me into a bulletproof vest. This did not communicate to me that I was going to be doing something safe. But before we get to bus ridership, a quick story about Sean. We were in rush hour traffic on I-95 on a weekday morning, and mostly responding to fender benders. I think they issued one ticket for some guy from Texas talking on his cell phone who didn't know. You can't do that in this state. This ain't Texas. But I was curious because most of the time we were crawling along in traffic or putting the siren on and people moving out of the way, which is kind of fun. But we were driving back after we were down in Lower Fairfield County, back up to Troop T headquarters in Bridgeport. And we're on I-95 and we're in the middle lane and we're in an unmarked car, okay? It's a Dodge Charger or something. It's a souped up car, but the lights are hidden. There's no way of knowing because he doesn't wear his hat, his, smoky hat. No way of knowing as you're driving past this car if it's a police officer or not. It's great. So we're in the middle lane, and he's left the left-hand lane open, and he said, I want to see if somebody's gonna, blow my doors off so I can pull them over. And I said, yeah, okay, I get that. That'll be fun. Just let me know when that's gonna happen. But I said, right now, all of the traffic, including us, is going about 70 miles an hour. The speed limit is 55. How do you decide who to pull over when everybody is driving 15 miles an hour over the speed limit? And I took my pen out and I had my reporter's notebook. He knew he was going to be quoted. He said, well, I'm only speaking for myself, not the department, but I look for the guy or someone who's weaving, who's likely to cause an accident. I went, okay, thank you. You basically said it's okay to drive above the speed limit. Not 105 miles an hour, as some people have been driving on I-84, but well above the speed limit. Let's talk about the buses, because the buses, I think, are very important. When COVID hit, ridership only went down a little bit. It dropped 50% versus 90% on the trains, and it has come back strong. And remember that the people that are taking the bus are different than the people who are taking the trains. Very often they do not own a car. They cannot telecommute. If you're a nurse or a plumber, you cannot do your job remotely. And in many cases, they are of lesser means. And that means that even though the fare is low, the gas tax holiday, which has brought, free bus fares, means a lot to them in terms of having more money to take home to buy food in an inflationary environment. So from a social justice point of view, that's had a profound impact. CT Transit represents 80% of all the bus passengers in the state. I hope when we get to the Q&A, somebody will ask me about CT Fast Track, which is the bus rapid transit system. But the really good news is that the free bus fares during the gas tax holiday, because these people are not buying gasoline, has meant that ridership is now better than it was pre-COVID. It's up to 105%. And I would predict there'll be a strong push to keep that going. It only costs $4 million a month in lost fare revenue. But if that puts more people on the bus and gets them to jobs where they're contributing to the economy, that's a small investment. Even in New York City, they have fare incentives. If you're on welfare or you get food stamps, you can get a reduction of 50% on your subway fare as well, too. So what's the long-term answer to all this? I mean, we're really talking about not the short-term money crunch, but how are we going to keep paying for mass transit, especially if the ridership does not come back strong on the trains? Something's got to give. And we have to go back to Dannel Malloy for all of the answers on this one, because when he was governor, he created a transportation finance panel to answer the question, how are you, the panel or the legislature, how are you going to pay for my huge dreams for expansion of transportation in the state? The program was called Let's Go CT. And there was something for everybody in that package. People in the quiet corner were going to get better mass transit. Airports were going to be expanded. It made Biden blush by its exuberance. However, as a good politician always does, the governor did not want, he wanted credit for the idea, but he did not want his fingerprints on the funding mechanism. So what do you do in that case? You create a blue ribbon panel, of which there are many, and which I have served, to come up with answers. So you can blame us with the ideas. The first thing they suggested was we need to put a lockbox in the Special Transportation Fund. That's where the money from the gasoline tax and DMV fees goes. That's supposed to be spent on transportation, but the legislature had regularly raided it like a petty cash box and used it to balance the budget from time to time. As a cynical friend of mine once said, the old Special Transportation Fund had as many back doors on it as a Hot Sheets Motel and the Berlin Turnpike. So it's now got a lockbox on it. It's got a padlock and a chain, and any money that goes in there has to be spent on transportation-related items. One of the candidates would tell you that still includes pensions for the DOT, but that's for another debate. That was a referendum passed by 83%, I believe, in 2018. Everybody in the state voted on it. One of the things that they also suggested, and by the way, this finance panel didn't say choose one or two, one from column A and one from column C. No, they said you got to do all of these things to come up with the money you're going to need to really invest in transportation. Back in '97, the legislature won a lot of brownie points. I mean, Girl Scout brownies. Won a lot of points by lowering the gasoline tax 14 cents a gallon. Highly popular politically. In the long run, pretty stupid because it lost us billions of dollars in money that would have paid for new trains and repairs to bridges before they started to deteriorate. So they said, slowly raise the gasoline tax back up couple cents a year for 7 years, raise the gross petroleum receipts tax as well too, propane, heating oil. They even suggested that the state look at the progressive idea of a vehicle miles tax. They have this in Oregon. They have it all throughout Europe. They're testing it in parts of California. What that says is that every 2 years, when you take your car to get the emissions checked, they check your odometer. They know how many miles you've driven. Okay. They don't know where you've driven, but they assume it was probably within the state. Unless you did been running drugs to California or something. So what they would say is, using a vehicle miles tax, we will not have tolls on our highways, but we will charge you based on the number of miles you've driven. So, Mr. Smith, you come in, you've driven 10,000 miles, here's a bill. Miss Jones, you just drive to church on Sunday mornings. You take the bus every other day of the week. You only drove 1,000 miles in the past year. Here's a much smaller bill for you. That idea, when it was floated by the governor, was so unanimously attacked that the legislature, even the Democrats who were in majority, passed a bill saying that the DOT, the Department of Transportation, could not even study such an idea. And then the last thing that they came up with was, yes, the T word, tolls. And depending on who you talk to, it would bring anywhere from $750 million to maybe twice that number in revenue every year, depending on how you did it. Did you charge trucks a huge amount more? You could give discounts because this was all going to be collected using E-ZPass. You could give discounts to commuters. You could give discounts to people that lived on one side or another of a bridge, but they had to get from Old Lyme to Stonington or something. However, even after years of fighting this, Governor Lamont finally threw his hands up in the air and said, I give. Tolls are just not going to happen. So he put a truck tax in instead. Remains to be seen if that's going to be upheld, because Rhode Island did something similar and it was just overturned as a violation of the Interstate Commerce Clause, I think. However, I asked this rhetorical question in the form of this political cartoon. Aren't we paying tolls already? The sign says, welcome to Connecticut, tolls in effect, blown tire, $200, bent rim, $399, damage suspension, $2,000. We're paying tolls because we're driving over lousy roads. We're paying them to Midas Muffler at our repair shop instead of paying them to the DOT to build the kind of roads that we wouldn't have those kind of repairs on. So you get what you pays for. That's my talk. Here's information about where you can read my column, the Commuter Action Group website, Gmail address, and on Twitter as well too.